Power often erodes gradually, yet few instances are as shockingly grotesque as the demise of King Philip II of Spain. This tale reveals the grim reality that even the mightiest are susceptible to the ravages of nature. Picture the summer of 1598 as the sun beats down on the Escorial Palace, where the man who once commanded half the known world faced an adversary far more insidious than rival monarchs or rebellious subjects, his own failing flesh. This is a story of absolute power confronted by absolute vulnerability, where the mighty are brought low and nature delivers its most brutal judgment upon the hubris of kings. Philip II of Spain reigned as the most powerful monarch of his era, ruler of the first truly global empire, controlling territories stretching from the Americas to the Philippines, the latter still bearing his name. Heir to Emperor Charles V, Philip's dominion spanned continents, justifying the boast that the sun never set within his realm. A fervent defender of Catholic orthodoxy during the Counter-Reformation, he inspired both reverence and fear, dispatching his formidable armada against England and financing bloody campaigns against Protestant dissenters across Europe. He was a man who saw himself as divinely appointed, his will law. Yet, despite his immense worldly authority, Philip's final battle was not waged on distant battlefields, but within the confines of his bedchamber. For 52 agonizing days during the sweltering Spanish summer, the king who had commanded armies and navies lay immobilized, trapped within his own putrefying body, as creatures infinitesimally smaller than his humblest subjects consumed him alive. This is not merely a narrative of physical suffering, although that suffering was undeniably profound. It is a stark contemplation on the limitations of human power, the inescapability of mortality, and the cruel egalitarianism of decay. This slow-motion collapse of a king stands as a haunting reminder that earthly glory is fleeting and that all flesh is ultimately grass. The Escorial Palace, which Philip had envisioned as both a royal residence and a grand mausoleum, became in a twist of fate the stage for his protracted and agonizing final act. Within its cold stone walls, a king accustomed to dictating the fate of nations found himself utterly powerless against the relentless onslaught of disease and parasites. The accounts of his final days, so harrowing, were long dismissed by historians as exaggerations. Modern medical analysis, however, suggests they were chillingly accurate. What follows is the true account of Philip II's horrific demise, a death so prolonged, so gruesome, and so profoundly degrading that it serves as a memento mori for all time. As we draw back the ornate royal bed curtains to reveal the decaying figure beneath, we are starkly reminded that, in the end, even kings return to dust, sometimes while still drawing breath, sometimes inch by excruciating inch, sometimes as a living feast for the lowliest of creatures. The initial harbingers of Philip's final decline appeared in the spring of 1598. At the age of 71, the king was already considered elderly for his time and had endured decades battling various ailments. Gout had plagued him since his 30s, contorting his fingers and toes into gnarled appendages, making writing and walking progressively difficult. Each year, the attacks intensified, spreading from his extremities to his knees, wrists, and shoulders. Philip had also developed a crippling form of arthritis, described by courtiers as leaving him unable to move hand or foot, not even to scratch his head. Compounded by persistent fevers, these conditions had confined the king to a wheelchair by 1591. Yet, he maintained his legendary work ethic, personally reviewing every significant state document, often annotating them with the curt instruction "No," a single word that could determine the fates of countless individuals across his vast empire. However, in June of 1598, Philip's condition deteriorated dramatically. A fresh wave of fevers left him delirious and profoundly weakened. More alarmingly, numerous abscesses began to erupt on his right knee and hand. These pustules would rupture and drain, only to reappear with renewed ferocity. Court physicians, constrained by the limited medical knowledge of the era, applied poultices and prescribed bloodletting, but the infection spread inexorably. Within weeks, the King of Spain was bedridden, capable of moving only his head and left arm. The most powerful monarch in Christendom found himself utterly dependent on servants for every bodily function. His rigid Spanish etiquette, which had established the most formal court in Europe, disintegrated in the face of basic human needs. The man who had once been approached only with elaborate genuflections now lay soiled in his own excrement when attendants failed to change his bedding promptly enough. The illusion of control so carefully cultivated throughout his reign shattered into the reality of his helplessness. As the intense heat of July descended, so did Philip's suffering. The abscesses multiplied, spreading across his chest, groin, and legs. From these festering wounds emanated a putrid stench so overpowering that even the most devoted attendants struggled to remain in the royal chamber. The sickening odor of rotting flesh permeated the palace corridors, forcing courtiers to press perfumed handkerchiefs to their noses as they passed near the king's quarters. Philip himself, still lucid enough to comprehend his predicament, ordered the windows kept closed. Not for his own comfort, but to prevent the royal stench from offending those outside. Contemporary accounts described the king's body as covered in pustules that would burst and refill with blood and pus. These sores never truly healed, but instead became breeding grounds for something far more horrifying. Immobile and unable to shift his position without excruciating pain, Philip lay upon sweat-soaked bedding that became an ideal breeding ground for infestation. Lice first appeared in early August, perhaps carried in by a palace servant or emerging from the increasingly foul bedding. They found an ideal host in Philip's festering body, warm, moist, and defenseless. The parasites multiplied rapidly, feeding on the king's blood and the abundant dead tissue of his lesions. Witnesses reported that lice swarmed so thickly over the king that attendants struggled to keep his body clean, despite repeated attempts. Diego Yepes, Philip's confessor, later wrote that the lice bred within the wounds themselves, emerging from the king's own putrefying flesh. Whether literally true or merely perceived as such by horrified observers, the effect was the same. The most powerful man in Europe had become a living hive of parasites. Some accounts mention specialized attendants dedicated solely to removing lice from the royal body, collecting them by handfuls only to find new swarms hours later. Yet, the lice were merely opportunistic feeders. The true horror lurked deeper within Philip's failing body. Royal physician Andres Zamudio de Alfaro documented that the king's wounds began to develop putrid and corrupt matter in which many maggots were engendered. These larvae, likely from common flies that entered through palace windows or doors, had found their way into the king's open lesions and begun to feed on his decaying tissue. Imagine the spectacle. A man once treated as semi-divine, whose very touch was believed by some to heal scrofula, now forced to witness worms writhing beneath his skin and emerging from his wounds. Each day, servants would clean away the maggots, only to discover new ones the following morning. Philip, fully conscious and increasingly drawing comfort from his Catholic faith, reportedly remarked, "Lord, how greatly these offenses against you weigh upon me, though it pleases me to think how small they are compared to my sins." By the end of August, new horrors emerged. The constant pressure against his immobile body had created massive bed sores, especially on his right hip and lower back. These pressure ulcers, worsened by his inability to move and the perpetual dampness of his bedding, eventually eroded through skin, fat, and muscle, exposing bone. Royal chronicler Fray de Yator described one ulcer on his right hip as growing so large that it was possible to see into the internal cavity of his body. This horrific wound, described as the size of a fist, developed its own grotesque ecosystem. Fray José de Sigüenza, who documented the king's final days, wrote that attendants removed enough material from this wound alone to fill 2 silver basins daily. More disturbingly, this cavernous lesion became the primary breeding ground for maggots, multiplying faster than they could be removed. Some contemporary accounts describe the larvae burrowing deeper when disturbed, literally consuming the king from within. The flies drawn to the king's wounds were not content to lay their eggs only in dead tissue. As Philip's condition worsened, they began to infest his mouth, nose, and ears. Unable to swat them away, the once feared monarch could only endure as insects crawled across his face and into his orifices. Some historians suggest Philip may have developed myiasis, a condition in which fly larvae invade living tissue in multiple sites throughout the body. Adding to this catalog of suffering was the king's worsening gout, making even the slightest touch to his extremities agonizing. Yet his body had to be moved and cleaned. Each time attendants attempted to change his position or remove soiled bedding, Philip's screams echoed through the palace halls. The monarch, who had once watched impassively as heretics burned at autos daf, now begged for mercy from his own servants. Throughout this horrific ordeal, Philip's mind remained largely intact. Perhaps the cruelest aspect of his deterioration was this clarity. He was fully aware of his transformation from sovereign to carrion. The king who had built the magnificent Escorial as a testament to Spanish glory and his own legacy now lay rotting within its walls, conscious of each new indignity visited upon his failing flesh. Despite his agony, Philip maintained remarkable composure regarding spiritual matters. He requested daily mass in his chambers and frequently asked for the reading of religious texts. The man who had championed Catholic orthodoxy across Europe remained steadfast in his faith, even as his body became a theater of horrors. When able to speak between bouts of pain, he would discuss affairs of state and the future of his vast empire with his son and heir, the future Philip III, displaying a remarkable commitment to his royal duties, even in the face of unimaginable suffering. By early September, new symptoms compounded the king's suffering. Persistent diarrhea, potentially stemming from intestinal infection or as a side effect of his treatments, further weakened him and contributed to the filth surrounding him. His renal function began to fail, causing his legs and abdomen to swell dramatically with edema. This fluid retention stretched his already compromised skin to the breaking point, resulting in new ruptures that provided additional entry points for infection and infestation. Court physician Garcia de Arade documented that the king developed a high fever accompanied by delirium, likely indicative of sepsis. In his more lucid moments, Philip reportedly asked repeatedly for a particular crucifix, the same one his father, Emperor Charles V, had held during his own death. This symbolic connection to his imperial legacy seemed to offer comfort even as Philip's bodily sovereignty dissolved into chaos and corruption. The treatments prescribed by royal physicians likely exacerbated the king's suffering rather than alleviating it. Adhering to humoral theory, doctors applied caustic substances to his wounds in an attempt to balance his bodily fluids. These chemicals, including arsenic compounds and mercury preparations, would have burned his already compromised tissues and potentially accelerated necrosis. Frequent bloodletting, sometimes performed daily, further weakened the monarch at a time when he desperately needed his strength. Philip's diet during these final weeks consisted mainly of broths, watered wine, and soft bread when he could manage to eat at all. The cumulative effects of infection, parasitic infestation, blood loss from medical treatments, and inadequate nutrition created the perfect storm for his body's complete collapse. His heart, straining against increasing systemic failure, began to exhibit signs of arrhythmia, with the king reporting palpitations and episodes of shortness of breath. Even the weather seemed to conspire against Philip. The summer of 1598 was exceptionally hot in central Spain, with the stone walls of the Escorial trapping heat like an oven. This elevated temperature accelerated the breeding cycles of the lice and flies tormenting the king and hastened the decomposition of his wounded flesh. The few windows in his chamber, kept partially closed to contain the stench, allowed little breeze to cool his fever-ridden body or disperse the miasma of decay that hung like a pall over the royal bed. By the second week of September, the end was clearly approaching. Philip, still conscious despite his extreme suffering, summoned his children to receive his blessing. His son, the future Philip III, who had largely been shielded from witnessing the worst of his father's decline, was visibly shocked by the transformed figure before him. The young prince reportedly had to leave the room several times to regain his composure, overwhelmed by both the sight and the odor of his once formidable father, now reduced to a writhing, infested shell. In a final act of kingly duty, Philip attempted to impart wisdom to his heir. Witnesses recounted that he cautioned his son about the ephemeral nature of earthly power, gesturing weakly to his own ruined body as proof. "I have been treated like an old dog," he reportedly told the prince. "Remember this when you wear the crown." Whether these words served as a warning against pride or a bitter acknowledgement of his abandonment by courtiers who could no longer bear his presence remains unclear. On September 13, 1598, Philip requested the final sacraments. His confessor administered extreme unction, anointing what few parts of the king's body could still be touched without causing agonizing pain. Throughout the ritual, observers noted flies continuously landing on the holy oil, drawn by the smell of putrefaction that no amount of incense could mask. In a macabre tableau worthy of the most ardent vanitas painter, the symbols of divine grace mingled with the evidence of mortal corruption. The king's final hours were marked by increasing respiratory distress as fluid filled his lungs, the final insult in a cascade of systemic failures. His breathing became labored and rattling, each exhale carrying the fetid odor of internal decay. At 5 a.m. on September 13th, after requesting the crucifix be placed on his chest, Philip II of Spain drew his last breath. The monarch who had commanded the wealth of the New World and the might of Europe's greatest army had finally been conquered by the smallest of adversaries. The task of preparing the royal corpse presented unprecedented challenges. Traditional embalming procedures proved nearly impossible due to the advanced state of decomposition. According to court records, the body was so compromised that it began to fall apart when moved. Royal embalmers worked swiftly, utilizing prodigious amounts of perfumes, spices, and preservative compounds in an attempt to make the remains presentable for lying in state. Despite these efforts, the king's body continued to deteriorate rapidly. Consequently, the funeral proceedings were abbreviated, with only the most essential rituals performed before the sealed casket was rushed to the royal crypt beneath the Escorial. There, Philip was interred alongside his father and his multiple wives, his physical corruption finally hidden from view, if not from memory or history. News of the king's horrifying end spread rapidly throughout Europe, eliciting a spectrum of responses. In Protestant England and the Netherlands, where Philip had been viewed as a tyrant and persecutor, accounts of his suffering were met with barely concealed satisfaction. Pamphlets circulated suggesting his gruesome death was divine retribution for the tortures of the Inquisition and the bloodshed of the Dutch Revolt. Queen Elizabeth II of England, Philip's longtime rival, reportedly remarked upon hearing the details, "We should not mock the afflictions of princes, for they remind us all of our common mortality." Conversely, in Catholic territories, particularly in Spain itself, official accounts of Philip's death were sanitized, emphasizing his piety and dignity in confronting his final trial. Court chronicles omitted the more disturbing details, focusing instead on his reception of the sacraments and his concern for the succession. The Spanish people were informed that their king had died as he had lived, as a pillar of Catholic virtue and royal fortitude. The gruesome reality was replaced with a carefully constructed narrative of saintly suffering. Medical historians now believe Philip suffered from a combination of conditions. His long-standing gout had likely evolved into a form of rheumatoid arthritis, weakening his immune system. This, combined with suspected diabetes indicated by symptoms of excessive thirst and edema, created ideal conditions for the development of multiple infections. The specific cause of his pustules and abscesses may have been a systemic staphylococcal infection, while his immobility led to stage 4 pressure ulcers, providing entry points for maggot infestation. The confluence of these ailments created the perfect storm for his agonizing decline. Philip's case is particularly striking, not only for the extent of his physical suffering, but for how it served as a macabre inversion of his earthly power. The monarch who had ordered thousands to their deaths on the battlefield could not command the insects to depart from his flesh. The king whose decree could condemn heretics to the flames could not prevent his own body from becoming a breeding ground for vermin. As historian William H. Prescott later wrote, "No amount of power or wealth could purchase exemption from the physical laws to which all mortality is subject." Philip's demise underscores the ultimate fragility of human existence, regardless of rank or stature. Philip's death serves as a potent memento mori, reminding us that power, no matter how absolute, offers no immunity from the fundamental vulnerabilities of the human condition. His demise exemplified the ultimate democratic principle: kings and commoners alike must confront the indignity of physical decay. The distinction lies in Philip's status, which ensured his suffering would be meticulously documented and remembered centuries later. The irony of his end was not lost on contemporary observers. Philip had devoted decades to wars defending Catholic orthodoxy and the divine right of kings. He had presented himself as God's chosen instrument on earth, the defender of true faith against heresy. Yet, his final days revealed no divine intervention, no miraculous preservation of the royal body. Instead, the most Catholic king endured a death that resembled punishment more than blessing, seemingly abandoned by the very God whose cause he had championed. For the Spanish Empire, Philip's death signaled the beginning of a long, slow decline. His son Philip III lacked his father's work ethic and administrative prowess. Within decades, Spain began to lose territories and influence, eventually relinquishing its position as Europe's dominant power. Some historians speculate that witnessing his father's horrific end contributed to the younger Philip's reluctance to fully embrace the burdens of kingship, preferring to delegate power to favorites while indulging in pleasure. The Escorial Palace, which Philip II had envisioned as the epicenter of global power and a monument to Spanish grandeur, would never again function as the effective command center of a world empire. Instead, it gradually transformed into what its architecture had always hinted it might become: a magnificent mausoleum, a silent witness to the transience of earthly glory. Today, visitors can tour the royal apartments where Philip suffered his agonizing end, hearing sanitized versions of his death that emphasize his piety rather than his physical corruption. Perhaps the most enduring legacy of Philip's horrific demise lies in its shaping of our historical imagination. His death serves as a poignant reminder that the distance between the heights of human power and the depths of human vulnerability is not as vast as we might like to believe. The king who governed half the world discovered in his final days that he could not govern the processes of his own body, a lesson as relevant to contemporary leaders as it was in the 16th century. Despite his territorial conquests and political maneuvering, Philip II is perhaps most vividly remembered today for the manner of his departure from this world. Not in glory on the battlefield, not in peaceful slumber surrounded by a loving family, but in a protracted nightmare of corruption and consumption. His story serves as a visceral reminder that history's judgment often hinges not on how we wield power, but on how we confront its inevitable loss. From the most powerful monarch of his age to a feast for worms not after death, as is the common fate, but while still living, still thinking, still feeling every bite. As we conclude this somber exploration of the final days of Philip II, we might contemplate the words purportedly discovered among his private papers after his death. To have been and not to be is not to be at all. For a king consumed by legacy and remembrance, there exists a profound irony in being remembered not for the empire he forged, but for the grotesque spectacle of his disintegration. His death has eclipsed his accomplishments in our collective memory, serving as a stark testament to the transient nature of power, the inevitable fading of glory, and the ultimate leveling force of nature returning all, kings and commoners alike, to dust, often inch by excruciating inch. The tale of Philip II serves as a chilling reminder of our shared mortality, a truth that transcends titles, crowns, and empires. So, as we've seen, the story of Philip II's final days is a stark reminder that even the most powerful among us are ultimately vulnerable to the forces of nature and the relentless march of time. It's a humbling tale, stripping away the illusion of control and revealing the shared human experience of decay and mortality that binds us all, regardless of titles or empires. The story isn't simply about a king's suffering, it's a powerful meditation on the transient nature of power and the enduring strength of the natural world. What are your thoughts on Philip II's story? Does it change the way you view power and legacy? We'd love to hear your comments, questions, or interpretations down below. Let's get a conversation going. And if you enjoyed diving into this fascinating and somewhat gruesome piece of history, please consider subscribing. We have so many more intriguing stories waiting to be explored, and we wouldn't want you to miss out. Thanks for watching.